made them in such a way that they will complement each other, right? He's almost like saying, this is the key that is missing. This is the key that is missing, right? He's not unaware that there's problems. He's not unaware that people are sinful. In fact, he knows better than anyone, right? He can kind of see from the divine perspective, just how far we've fallen. Like we think we have, but he probably sees it even deeper, right, than we do. And yet he's giving us this key that somehow we are not taking this into account. We're not taking into account. It's not just like, oh, in the beginning there was sinlessness and now we have sin. But in the beginning, there was a way I designed you to fulfill one another's hearts, and you're missing it, and you're not seeing it, right? And you're not fully living it. And when you do, miracles are going to happen.
Throughout life, we meet others who have insights and experiences quite unlike our own. The great ideas of classical works resonate differently with them. Often these treasures of mind and heart go unshared, reserved from others in the course of daily life. But what if we took the time to have those conversations, to sit down and recall those thoughts, those impressions upon us that moved us along our path? Why then, we would no longer be alone, and at least for one shimmering moment, someone else could see the world through our eyes. I give you the Confederal Reserve. Welcome to the Confederal Reserve, presented by BetterPears. I am your host, Dr. Jason Fugikawa. The Confederal Reserve is a show that connects old friends, that is, Confederates, to discuss the ideas and classical works that have shaped their lives and worldviews. Before we get going, I will invite you to like this episode, subscribe to the BetterPears channel, and click on the icon to receive notifications so that you remain the first to know of future interviews and podcast episodes. Now then, the structure of our show is our gimmick we want you to mimic. Our guest for this episode will offer a classical work of particular import to his or her life. What ensues is a conversation that uncovers insights and offers new perspectives on old works. It is a conversation between friends, which is the building block of the cultural renaissance that BetterPears seeks to foster. Our guest today is Dr. Irene Alexander, Associate Professor of Theology at the University of Dallas, founder of Adored for Life, and Certified Relationship Coach. In addition to her teaching, research, and coaching interests on sexual complementarity and the writings of Pope St. John Paul II, Irene is a wife and mother of 6. It is my great pleasure to welcome our guest today on the Confederal Reserve, Dr. Irene Alexander. Welcome, Irene.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
It's great to have you here on the Confederal Reserve. And we'll get started right away with, so what is your vintage work and why is it so important?
Yeah, so today I want to talk a little bit about John Paul II's Theology of the Body. Maybe you've heard of this before. It's actually titled Man and Woman, He Created Them, A Theology of the Body. That's the subtitle, but it's now more known by the subtitle than the original name of the work.
Yeah, so it does come up. It is one of those Catholic buzzword kind of works of the last century or so, but has become sort of a classic in its own right. So what about this work is so important to you?
Yeah, so one of the things that really strikes me about the Theology of the Body is that it's really at heart an anthropology. And what I mean by that is it's telling us something about who we are and what we're made for. Who we are and what we're made for. I feel like this is something that just in general in our society, we've kind of lost, we've kind of come away from in a variety of different avenues. And I see it a lot in moral theology. I see it in a variety of contexts. But in a way, it's sort of the most fundamental and most critical question is, who are we as human beings? Who are we as men and women? And what ultimately are we made for? And he's going to answer that question, in a fairly deep way, that in a certain sense, we're made for love. That's the fundamental thing that we all want, that we all deeply, deeply desire in our hearts. And so what John Paul II, what he does is he takes us through kind of it's called sort of a triptych, but a kind of like a 3-part icon of and vision of who man is. Who was man in his creation? Who did God make him to be? And that before the fall, right? Before there was sin and injustice in the world. Who is he now? How does he live now in light of the situations that we find ourselves in? And then ultimately, what's his final destiny? What does it mean that we're called to eternal life? So he's kind of giving us this very broad view, but also then goes down into a lot of detail. And the theology of the body actually starts out, well, like I say, it's framed with the words of Christ. So each of those three parts begins with different words of Christ from the gospel. So the first part has to do with how the Creator created the male and female. And this is the part I kind of want to focus our conversation for today. But just so you know, it's one of three parts. The middle section, the words of Christ, have to do with the state of us in a state of sin, and that he says in the Beatitudes, that he who lusts after a woman has already committed adultery with her in the heart. Okay, so then there's a kind of a meditation on that. And then the final part, when the Sadducees ask Jesus, oh, look, this woman, she married someone, then her husband died, then she married the brother, then he died. Who's she going to be married to in heaven? And he surprises them with the answer that in heaven they will neither marry nor be given in marriage. And the reason ultimately is because there's the true and final marriage between God and his people, right? And that's kind of a theme revealed over and over in scripture. But I want to come back for a minute to that beginning part. In the beginning.
Okay. But maybe before you get into that, because I've got some, like my word analysis kind of hairs went up when you talked about the theology of the body, right? Because I had this conversation. Every theologian has this conversation with a parent at some point where you have to basically explain to your parent that you want to study theology professionally, right? So I had this phone call from Fordham in the Bronx. I was calling Cincinnati back home to my mom, explaining to her, okay, Mom, I want to major in theology. She's like, that's about God, right? I was like, yes, that's right, Mom. That's about God. But don't worry, I'm also going to double major in classical languages, for the money. So it was a beautiful conversation that I had with her. Anyway, but she was right on, right? Theology, like logos and theos, right? So, sort of the study or the reason, what we know, right? The applied intellectual activity towards what is revealed by God. So, but then you mentioned theology of the body as like an anthropology. And so in our kind of pantheon of higher education, anthropology is a major distinct from theology. So what's going on there? Is there some sort of like turf war between theology and anthropology? How do you see those kind of two connected, or what's the lay of the land on that side of things?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I'm so glad you brought that up. And to be honest with you, I had my own conversation with my parents. I actually was going to go into medicine. I wanted to be a medical doctor. I wanted to be a pediatrician, maybe pediatric cardiologist. And then I called them, I'm switching to theology. They're like, what? Like, you were the one who wanted to go to med school. And they're like, please choose a double major that will be practical. So I chose philosophy because it's practical for theology. It's very important. I don't think that's probably what they had in mind. But anyway, there you go. But to your question, yeah, any theology is ultimately a study about God, right? Who he is and our relationship to him. And so what a striking and weird phrase, a theology of the body, because God doesn't have a body. So what are we even talking about here? And the reason I say it's a kind of an anthropology is because how do we know about God? We know about God through two ways, either through what he directly revealed to us in scripture, or we also know about him through his effects, i.e., what he has created. And so we can learn about who he is, something about who he is, through what he's created and through what he's revealed to us in scripture. And in a way, the theology body does both. It starts with the words of Christ revealed to us in scripture. And it also is going to focus in on a very particular way on what it means that the Creator made us male and female. So it's going to look at that angle, but always with an eye to, and I think this is the deeper thing, what that tells us ultimately about God. So, there was one time I learned that, I learned this from N.T. Wright, I think. There's a sculpture by an artist named Rodin, and he has this image of a man and a woman, and they're kind of like touching fingers like this, and he calls it the cathedral. And it's so beautiful because it's kind of like saying that this love between a man and a woman tells us something. It is like a cathedral. It tells us something about who is there. And in the Old Testament, when we hear that man and woman are made in the image of God, what that meant from a historical perspective is that in the different temples, different pagan temples, they would all have an image of who is the God who resides there, who's the God that you worship here, right? And so in one sense, when we read in scripture that he made them he made man and woman in the image of God, it's like saying, look at this beautiful thing. Look at this love between a man and a woman, and this will tell you something about who our God is like, right? And the main thesis actually of the theology of the body is that creation itself has a kind of sacramental quality to it. And here I mean that word not necessarily in terms of the 7 sacraments, but by analogy, that the visible things tell us something about what is ultimately invisible. Okay, and we see this later with St. Paul, who tells us that look at the love of man and woman, husbands as they lay down their lives for their wives, wives as they receive this love. And there's a deeper mystery here, and that deeper mystery has to do with the love of Christ and his church. Okay, so it's saying that, like, look, the deepest way to understand ourselves and what we're here and what we're made for, that all of this created being actually is telling us a deeper truth about who fundamentally God is and what's his plan for us, how we relate to him.
And I think that there is, the guidance of Revelation in that, in my mind, I want to call it like an extrapolation, right? You take what is revealed in creation, but there's a lot of things that need to be sort of filtered out, right? So human sin, the materiality of, the finitude of our material existence, even sort of the finitude of our spiritual existence, right? The way that our intellect and will are malformed, and also our kind of impotency relative to act, right? That God's infinite act is it's not just a difference in degree, but a difference in kind. One could say to what is highest in us, namely our faculties, our powers, our intellect, and our will. And so I see that as sort of like a perilous journey of extrapolation, of taking what is revealed by nature and then extrapolating to what must be highest in being, namely God, right? And perhaps that's why the ancient philosophers have so many screw ups, right? They try for a long time and only a few do it, and they have a lot of mess ups, right? A lot of kind of false ideas that they kind of fudge the answers on and just kind of smile and nod because the divine is so much beyond their reach outside of Revelation. So I'm hoping there's sort of like a rule or measure or way that in his work Theology of the Body, John Paul II sort of tempers what can go wrong in extrapolating human nature through Genesis 1, 2, and largely 3 to what must be the case of who God is.
Yeah, for sure. And like you said, that's why we do theology, right? To try to make a careful understanding of what it is that God is actually telling us. I think all of us probably have encountered somebody using scripture in a way that just to prove a point, and you wondered, well, is that really what was meant by that? I'm not sure. And I think that, for example, I think also of St. Augustine in his Confessions, who had some ideas about the Old Testament that actually prevented him, and even philosophical ideas, some limiting beliefs, you could even say, that kept him from actually seeing what God was really trying to reveal there. And it was in some ways through philosophy, in some ways through friends, and also through grace, that those things were purged, and he was able to come to this deeper understanding of who God is and how he was meant to relate to God, what was the calling for his life and his ultimate destiny. So yeah, I mean, that's a much bigger conversation on scriptural principles and all those things. But I think part of the nexus of this, and maybe we can go from here now into that first part of the Theology of the Body, how it actually opens, is exactly on this difficulty of what is our nature and what are we made for, and what happened and where's the sin? Okay, because this is an area that if you get this wrong, it's very off. Everything else goes wrong from here, right? In fact, there's whole philosophies that are essentially kind of characterizing fallen man as like, this is what man is like. This is normal, you know? And so being able to sort through carefully, what are we made for? Also acknowledging the real reality of human sinfulness, our need for grace, and yet the truth that God has come to redeem us. And if he's come to redeem us, he's making it really possible for us to live in the way that he designed for us to live. So I'd love to just go to the opening of the Theology of the Body, where it's focusing on the words of Christ, that in the beginning, God created the male and female. Okay. And the context in which this arises in Matthew's gospel. Okay. So John Paul opens with citing Matthew's gospel from Matthew chapter 19. And it's the Pharisees who are asking Jesus about the question of divorce. Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? Now, I want to just pause here because probably many of us have heard the scripture and know what it says, but I just want you to just take a minute and actually think through what Jesus was probably thinking as he's hearing this. Okay, they're bringing to him this question about people who are having such a difficult time in their relationship that they feel like there's really no other way. The pain is so great that we have to separate, that we have to divorce. Okay, and so he's probably thinking about with love and compassion about how hard the situation is. Okay. And so here's his reply. He says, have you read that at the beginning, the Creator made them male and female? Now, let's just pause there just for 1 second. Have you read that in the beginning, the Creator made them male and female? I mean, part of me wants to say like, well, look, Lord, like who cares about the beginning? That's when it was sinless, like what, that's almost like, how does that even help us? Like that's at a time before there was human sin and suffering and deficiencies and problems. Okay. So like, is it even like loving for you to even mention that? Like, you see what I'm saying? But why?
Right.
Why would he mention that? Okay. And he continues, for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will be one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one. And therefore, what God has joined together, let man not separate. So not only does he reiterate the divine plan from the beginning, he reiterates it even at a time when he knows that right now we suffer and we have difficulty and there's heartache. Okay. But he also is giving us the key. Okay. And the key was this: in the beginning, he made them male and female. He made them male and female, right? In other words, he made them in such a way that they will complement each other, right? He's almost like saying, this is the key that is missing. This is the key that is missing, right? He's not unaware that there's problems. He's not unaware that people are sinful. In fact, he knows better than anyone, right? He can kind of see from the divine perspective, just how far we've fallen. Like we think we have, but he probably sees it even deeper, right, than we do. And yet he's giving us this key that somehow we are not taking this into account. We're not taking into account. It's not just like, oh, in the beginning there was sinlessness and now we have sin. But in the beginning, there was a way I designed you to fulfill one another's hearts, and you're missing it, and you're not seeing it, right? And you're not fully living it. And when you do, miracles are going to happen. Okay, so I see him as pointing to two things. One is something that's created, right? This fundamental structure of our being, in being male and female, and the way that we're actually designed to delight one another. And I'm going to go into that maybe in a little more detail. And
Sure.
the second part is the appeal to divine grace, right? That what man thinks is impossible, by way of Christ and his grace, he's making it possible, right? In other words, it's not just like we're just going to try to do this completely on our own, but that by grace, he's going to make it easy, right? So it's going to require two kinds of illumination or awakening. One is the rediscovery of how he designed romantic love, the rediscovery of that. And at the second place, it's going to require us to be more deeply attuned to our own need for divine grace. And that's what I see in the just the very first page, just the opening here of the Theology of the Body.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful because now in my mind, I have kind of two uh, foci or whatever of kind of lines of questioning. One would be, I think you mentioned the word sort of the complementarity is ordered towards uh, delight, and so that sort of delectation. I want to kind of probe into that a little bit in terms of I'm very teleologically minded.
Yeah,
It's like,
love it.
I have this like running trope with some of my students about ham sandwiches, uh, in the sense of like that is, if I want to make a ham sandwich, I want to basically enjoy a ham sandwich. There's multiple ways, means, and kinds of things I can do. They always think about like ordering it or like buying the pieces or like farming all the various parts of a ham sandwich. I always bring up theft as a means for achieving a ham sandwich to kind of bring in this idea that right in the end ham sandwich, which is still approximate end to the final end of human existence. That might be controversial to some, but I'm just not. It's not all about the ham sandwiches. And the whole reason I use a ham sandwich is because a ham sandwich is a funny word. Some words are funny, some words aren't. Turkey sandwich, not as funny. Ham sandwich, funny. Anyway, uh, so teleologically, right, the end in mind, the purpose, the goal, right? If the goal of sexual complementarity is a delight, right? What is the nature of that delight? Because if we don't know the nature of that delight, it might kind of confuse the means we use to achieve it. So
Right.
if we could kind of entertain that first part under the guise of I really want to know what that delight is and how you define it or how John Paul II defines it,
Yeah.
and then I might poke at that even more. So
Yeah, that is, I love that you brought it to that point because one, first of all, the delight, and then secondly, if saying if we misunderstand this, we might misunderstand the means to bring it about. Like you just clarified everything
the
in one
ordered
second.
means, right? Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, the ordered
we come
means.
up with
Yeah,
a whole lot of
ruling out theft. It's a
disordered means to
possibility,
do things. Yes.
but yeah, exactly. Remember, there's order in things. But let me just focus first on this idea of delight, and I think even just resurrecting that as an idea is so important and often underlooked because I see the contemporary conversation about this kind of like this. Like there's a lot, and this is broad strokes, okay? So not like giving a nuanced critique of everything that's out there, um, but in broad strokes, there's a kind of sense in like, okay, well, we want to have a happy marriage, and if it's not working out, there's a kind of secular view that's like, well, it's okay, just doesn't matter, leave your commitments, you know, it and it's kind of like maybe an over sentimentalized version of what marriage is in the sense that like that there's no actual concrete vows. And actually, one time in my marriage class, we did a little project where we tried to see if are there any movies out there where in marriage they're actually like saying vows to each other rather than just saying how they feel. Like, and how you feel is important. I'm not going to deny that, but there's an actual vow there that you're making. Okay, so on the one side, you have this sense of like, if you feel at any point unhappy, just leave, okay, and we'll empower you to do that, okay. But on the other hand, there's pushback against that. Well, hey, well, like, isn't there don't you make a commitment here, and aren't there children involved, and like, and you're not really meant to be happy in your marriage. It's just supposed to purify you and make you holy. Okay, have you heard this? Because this also comes from religious circles, and I also think it's
Yeah.
wrong. It's the flip side, okay. And there's a kind of back and forth sort of like, whatever, you do what's right for you, it doesn't matter anybody else, okay.
Well,
And then the response is, no, that's wrong. And so like any attempt at thinking you should be happy was wrong to begin with. Oh, love is not a
it,
feeling. How many times have you heard that, even
um,
from the pulpit? Oh, it's not a feeling. Well, look, how are you going to have emotional intimacy without feelings, right?
I
So
mean,
there's something missing.
back to my ham sandwich, my
Yeah.
beautiful moral theology trope here. Right, there could be some who argue in a very strong Augustinian route that like food or ham sandwiches and the rest of the category of food would only be for like sustenance, right? You only eat to survive, right? But the whole idea of enjoying the food that you're eating, right? Can we put salt in the gruel kind of thing, right? Would be to go beyond its purpose in life. And so yeah, you can see that kind of like a rigorist kind of interpretation that
Yeah.
is a pendulum swing too far than the idea that the multiplicity of the fruit in the garden allows for different combinations of enjoyment of the things that are to sustain our bodily existence.
Yeah, great. I love that. The idea of like, well, look, isn't this just for the survival of the human race? Okay. And right, in one sense, this is where procreation happens, or should happen. So definitely we see that that's one of the key ends of marriage. However, just like you were saying with food, is the only purpose, is the only thing accompanying it, our sustenance or our survival, right? And clearly that's one of nature's purposes. Look, if you don't keep eating, you will eventually die, right? So you need to do this. But the question is it wrong to enjoy it, right? Or is that a sort of
Right.
a part of the whole thing? And I think that the way that we talk about a lot of these questions and even moral questions today has a kind of like Kantian angle to that. And what I mean by
I
that
was
is,
thinking Kant. I was
yeah,
thinking
I'm
Kant.
referring to a philosopher whom you have I studied, who was actually very concerned for ethics and morality, wanted there to be some kind of objective account to it, especially at a time where there was a kind of sentimentalism that was sort of eroding what he saw as like, we need to have these standards. But he kind of went a little too far insofar as saying that like the kind of the morally right thing to do is to just be so rigorous that you do everything out of duty, and beyond that, if you enjoy it, it's not even really morally right. Okay, like to the extent that you actually enjoy it at all, you haven't yet have a pure moral disposition. Okay, and I think that this idea, it's reactionary, but it's everywhere. It's in modern life. A
Right.
lot of people
Right.
think that this is sort of a Catholic view of things, and they're wrong. It's not. It's just a part of what we imbibe as sort of these sort of cultural trends. And go back to what Christ's words in the beginning. That's not how it was in the beginning. In the beginning,
Right.
they delighted each other. They delighted each other, right? And so this one side of the conversation that's like, I'm looking for this delight and I'm not finding it, therefore I leave. Like there's something true in their search, in their longing for this delight, right? And I want to affirm that as something, a longing that God actually put in our hearts, right? On the other side, there's something true here. Well, it can't be that every time we come up against a struggle, we just abandon everything, right? There has to be this search for how were we meant to delight one another. So should we jump into this a little bit more?
Yeah, well, just yeah, my philological kind of bent. The word for delight, at least in the Vulgate and in Latin, is this deligere, right? Deligo, deligere. That comes from that root lig, which is the idea of like ligament or binding.
Finding.
And I think it has the sort of elect like diet, delectation, right? The uh, the same kind of terminal root there that we would get from something like Lego, uh, but back to the sort of ligament idea, right? That somehow delight is a derivative, right, or sort of a response to being sort of bound to something, right? Which is sort of antithetical to maybe like a oppressor slavery narrative, very Marxian in the sense of someone's controlling me, right? The man fight against this, and I'm if I'm being oppressed, if I'm bound, if I'm held to something, then I can't be free. And it kind of I have sort of Chesterton in my ear too, right? Sort of the truly free man is the one who can voluntarily bind himself, right? Who can take oaths and vows to kind of hold himself in account because he is free to hold himself into account. And that is, I think, in sort of Catholic marriage, right, one of those necessary requirements that they are not compelled. Not a shotgun wedding here, right? They're not compelled either by force or and some sort of emotional or psychological coercion into entering into this sort of binding, right, this vowed relationship. And in the freedom of doing that, right, there comes sort of the delight and the sense of enjoyment, right, the sense of happiness, because one is freely entering into this sort of vocation of service to one's spouse, and then the derivatives of that, right, the family that ensues. So that's my closing thought, or maybe an opening thought on delight and its relationship to being connected, being sort of bound voluntarily to another.
Yeah, how beautiful. I love how you put that. Delight in being bound to one another. Now, I think to the modern ear, sometimes when we hear that word binding, we feel like the hairs, prick up.
Yeah.
We feel a little bit stressed. And why is that? Because I think that we tend to think about freedom as simply the ability to do whatever it is that I want. Okay. And there's something to that, right? And I could go so deep into this right now, but the thing is, let's say you have all the freedom in the world. Now what? Now what do you want to do? What do you want to have? What is the desire on your heart? What is it? What do you yearn for more deeply, right? If you're really honest with yourself, you want the love of belonging, right? You want to belong. And I think sometimes we're like very accustomed to hearing that love is simply doing a good deed for somebody else. And that's a version of love, and that's part of love. But I think the deepest meaning of love is belonging, knowing that you are mine and I am yours, right? And that's actually even how Christ describes the love he has with the Father, right? That he belongs to him, that I am, Father, you see me, you know me, we belong to each other, right? And we see this about in all relationships, right? We see, especially in family relationships, knowing that deep sense of I belong here, right? They love me, they see me for who I am, they accept me, and I find my purpose and my meaning in giving myself and my heart in this way, right? That we're called to a kind of deeper communion, and we long to belong. I just came up with that right now. We literally do. We long to belong to one another, and that we were meant to find joy and happiness in that, right? And one of the things that always strikes me, even when I teach moral theology, is how Aquinas and also like Aristotle before him starts the conversation by talking about happiness, by talking about what ultimately fulfills us, right? It's not first like, what are the rules? What are the things? Who's supposed to do what, right? It's what does the human heart ache for so deeply that only this will satisfy, right? That's where the conversation needs to begin. And then from there, we see kind of the need for commitments, right? The need to belong. The other day I was chatting with a friend of mine. She's single and she's kind of looking to meet somebody. And I started, we were talking about what are the trials of modern dating and whatever. And she was saying that at one point I said to her,
hellscape of
oh
modern
my
dating.
gosh.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And at one point I said to her, like, I understand the ache you feel to want to be married, and she was kind of trying to like hold back the tears in her eyes, and I saw them, and she saw that I saw them, and like when I described it like an ache, it really resonated with her because it was real. She aches for that in her being, right? And that's not by accident, right? That's how he made us, to be delighted in, to be seen, to be known, for women in particular, to be adored, right? To be loved tenderly. The other day at Mass, I saw another couple, and the husband had his arm around his wife. And it just struck me the way that a man has this kind of very protective love for her, because he sees that she's precious, right? He sees that in her, and he wants to protect that, right? And he wants to show up and give his strength to her and for the family, right? And she wants to be loved in that way, right? She wants that. And so going back to what we were saying earlier, the delight, the ache that we have for that is real, because that's what God wants for us. He wants us to experience.
I would say on the topic of that ache, right? That perhaps unlike other feelings and emotions that come to us, it is like that the ache to be in communion with another, right? For the sort of the fulfillment of one's vocation of being not alone, and granted, right, for the clergy and religious, right, and they have to have that relationship with God, right? That relationship that fills that solitude, right? That there complements the solitude, so that it isn't solitude, right? But it is a union, a real union with God in something that sort of prefigures the next life. But for us lay people, right, that ache is, I would say, like it is a feeling that endures, whereas other kind of things that confront us. So I'll admit, one of my emotional weaknesses is like military veterans, right? Just like Memorial Day, right? Veterans Day, like watching old guys kind of march, like just brings tears to my eyes. Don't know what it is. But it's just kind of there, right? But I can avoid tearing up by not going to those parades, right? like I can kind of hide from that, right? And we watch people in sort of addiction cycles and whatnot, like that if they drink or they go to drugs, narcotics, and those kinds of things to avoid having difficult feelings. You can avoid that in sort of the modern world, but this particular ache of not being complimented endures, right? You can't, you can try to stuff other things in your life to avoid having the fullness of that feeling, but it always comes back. And so there's something sort of enduring and weighing upon the single people in that state of unclear vocation that I think is just an aspect of our age, whereas in perhaps previous generations, not from time immemorial, there probably were other times in the history of humanity where this was another problem of just sort of kind of unanticipated singleness late into life. But particularly for our moment, I think it is an enduring ache that can't just be stifled, can't just be quelled by pharmaceuticals or other kind of quick patches. That it is something that has to sort of just continually be felt by individuals.
Yeah, and I mean, I would go so far as to say that what John Paul II calls this is the spousal meaning of the body, and I think what he means by that is also like that ache in our hearts, right? This desire to be given in love, this desire to be received in love, to be seen as we are, in our vulnerability, and to know that we belong. And that it's safe to give ourselves and our hearts and our bodies fully, and to be received also in that way. And the ache endures because it's how we're made. And it's those desires that we have, I think, are signposts, they're signals of ultimately the communion that we're made for. And so I don't think we would expect it to sort of just go away, because in a sense it's a part of something that's deeply rooted in our hearts.
Yes. Yeah. No, that's true. Anyway, I was cutting you off. So what was you were getting at?
Oh yeah. So just going forward with this a little bit, if I could pull another quote from the Theology of the Body, there's a fascinating line. There's so many fascinating things, but he goes into some books in the Old Testament, and he's giving his own commentaries here on the love between man and woman. And one of the things he says is that the bride presents herself before the eyes of man as the master of her own mystery. So what a beautiful line. The bride presents herself before the eyes of man as the master of her own mystery. And the more I reflected on it, the more I realized, wow, this is really true. And what I think he means by this is that there's a kind of I don't know how to put this in my own words here, kind of a spiritual physics to romantic relationships. And it's that when young boys and girls develop into becoming young men and women, there's a sexual attraction, and there's, men desire women and women desire men, but there's something very unique that's happening here. There's actually where a man's world opens up and woman comes before him as like this incredible force to which he's attracted, and he wants so much to win over one. He wants one of them he wants to know, can I like outdo the other guys, the other competition here, and win her, right? So there's something about her that like, oh my gosh, like if only she would say yes to me, right? And on the other side, women, they're not interested in every man in the world, right? They don't think every single one is going to be the one for them, but they're looking for the one who will come through for them, right? The one who sees them as they are and in their beauty, and will literally pursue them, right? And so in this line here that she's the one who's sort of master of her own mystery, it's like recognizing that at the heart of human sexuality, there's an imbalance of power. There is the woman who is pursued, and there's the man who pursues her. Now, what's interesting about this, I think the more I reflected on it, is that let's put it like this. Pursuer and pursued relationships, they exist in other contexts. So let me give you an example. Like, let's say you want to be hired for a job, okay? And there's only one spot that they're going to hire, and you got all these applicants, and you're trying to outdo your competition, and you're trying to land this one spot for the job. But the employer is the one who will look at everyone, and decide who is it that I'm going to accept, and I'm going to reject everybody else. Okay, so in this situation, the employer is the one who's kind of in the seat of a very powerful place in that pursuer-pursued relationship, because they're going to be the ones who says, yes, this is the one I say yes to. Well, in God's design, this is how he set it up, right? And I keep thinking back to the words of Christ, like, in the beginning, this is how I set it up. In the beginning, this is the key, right? That it's woman who really inspires a man to come after her, right? To pursue her. Something about her femininity that is so attractive that the man wants to just, outdo everyone else and win her over, right? And who is the one who is going to decide at last, is this going to go, are we yes or not, right? She decides. She's the one who's going to receive him, right? Think about what happens, right before couples get engaged. The man proposes the idea of marriage to her, right? Will you marry me, right? She's not the one who's like, will you marry me, right? I mean, nowadays, who knows what's going on, but in terms of like what they deeply desire and that ache of their hearts, right? She wants him to fight for her, right? To pursue her, to make her feel adored and loved. And she's the one who ultimately is going to decide, do I say yes to this proposal or do I say no, right? Am I going to receive him, right? Because when she receives him, notice that it delights them both. Back to that delight, right? She's inspiring him. He pursues her, which is what he wants to win at, and it's what she wants. And when she receives him, they delight each other's hearts, right? He feels admired. Out of all the men in the world, she picked him. Oh my gosh, she picked him, right? And she feels that delight in her heart because he adores her, right? And this is how, like, I could tell you right now, like, or anyone listening, like, I know your love story. I know how you met and fell in love. Even if we never met, something like this happened. Either you were friends for a long time and then something changed in the relationship, or you were not, you just met and it was kind of like more of an instant attraction. But at some point, something about your femininity inspired him. He made a move on you romantically. And then at some point you said yes, right? You received him. And that pattern just kept happening over and over until at last you got married.
Yeah. What I find interesting about that rhythm or that pattern is that that move, right? The gutsy move that the man makes. In a certain sense, boys don't make this, men make this move, right? To kind of be vulnerable to her, like, hey, will you marry me? Right? This idea of this, all I got here. Like, this is this is my case. I've hopefully made my case as to who I am and what I've got going for me, and all the the conditions of life and those kinds of things, and kind of leaves himself open for that yes or no, right? Which is why you don't propose with a jumbotron, because then all that social pressure to say yes kind of confuses things. You don't get a real answer, right? If you want to take a good survey, you make it anonymous. Well, you can't necessarily make a marriage proposal anonymous, which would be weird, and they're probably going to make some reality TV show about that. But anyway, but giving her, right, the kind of the protected status of being able to say yes or no, and yet at the same time, right, his vulnerability kind of exposing himself to rejection in that way is normally, right, kind of antithetical to this idea of him pledging to be her protector, right? So he needs to be, in a certain sense, right, making her invulnerable to the rest of the world, and he does this in an act in which he is incredibly vulnerable to her, right? And
Yeah.
so this idea of and something that I think is perhaps missing in the exciting social media commentary on alpha males and sigma males and all these other kinds of things, right? Is that there is the complementarity of the sexes allows for a man to be incredibly vulnerable at the opportune time, but that relationship he has with her exclusively, his vulnerability to her, right, and not and not just in the marriage proposal, but kind of the way our family laws are set up, right? There's a vulnerability uh, in engaging in like civil marriage, right? Which is probably a little bit far beyond what should be vulnerable for sacramental marriage. That aside, uh, it seems to not just be a one size fits all. That just the alpha male is strong in every aspect, and even strong in relationship to her. But that the vulnerability is appropriate because the belief, right, and the complementarity is that while they can expose their vulnerability to each other, right, her and sort of right, revealing her beauty and desirability that excites him to pledge himself, right, she's vulnerable there because she could be rejected, right,
Right. Right.
unrequited,
Love.
flirtations and uh, kind of movements to incite his response, that can be a vulnerability as well, but that their inner vulnerability allows them as a couple to be strong and protected as a whole.
Yeah, I just love how you put that, because it is showing you, yeah, that mutual vulnerability uh, is really what is going to bind them together. And at the same time, it looks different for both of them. And, going back to what we were saying earlier, like, well, I just want to be free. In the end, you don't really, that's not the ultimate thing you want. In the end, what you really want is to be seen for who you really are and loved. Right. And that's really, again, at the heart of what God, I think, wants for us, and the delight that we're meant to have with each other. And also to know that vulnerability is a responsibility. So once that you're at that point in the relationship where you are you're married, and you've expressed this mutual vulnerability, that's something that has to be handled with care, precisely because this other person has opened up their heart to you in that way, and vice versa. And living together, again, also is very vulnerable. You see each other's quirks and flaws and imperfections and shortcomings, and then the question for love is, what do you do with that, right? And it's important for us to recognize that it is a responsibility not to use each other's vulnerability as a weapon against each other. But I think that here's why it does happen. And going back to that question in the beginning about the couple hurting, and what say you, Jesus, about this and divorce and all this, right? Going back to that, is that when we open our hearts to each other in this way, vulnerability is a little bit risky, right? Because on the one hand, it's the way by which we bond and belong to each other. But on the other hand, you're also opening yourself to possible critique, right? And so what can happen is, once we're in that relationship, what can happen is a woman who is trying to express what she wants or needs from him can end up doing it in a way that actually hits him in that place of vulnerability, and it hurts him and wounds him, but she doesn't realize it, right? Because the way she thinks is so different from the way he's thinking and the way his heart is, that it doesn't even sound like that's what she's doing. It feels like we're just communicating honestly, right? But because of that
Right.
vulnerability, it ends up being wounding, right? And then to deal with that, what do you do when you're wounded? Like the first thing you do, if you got wounded, what do? You probably cry out in pain, and then you
Sure.
run away to tend to the wound, right? And this is also what we see, that like sometimes husbands get very frustrated and angry, and then kind of shut down, and it's not because they don't care, and it's not because they don't um, they don't want the relationship to be great, but because they feel wounded in a way that they can't quite express, and she doesn't even know that that's happened. And yet that reaction from him, like, look, he's crazy, he's yelling, he's shutting down, that's wounding to her. Why? Because the way that she was meant to be loved back, right? And so what ends up happening is the way she wants to get more or communicate what she needs can be hurtful to him, and then his reaction becomes hurtful to her, and then she tries again, and then you're again, and each one hurting each other, but not even actually intending it, not even realizing that it's happened. And if I could just share one quote from another beautiful text John Paul wrote called Love and Responsibility.
Ah, yes.
And I'll just share just one quote from there. And he says this, he calls it kind of like the true test of love. Okay. And you're like, oh, I wonder what that is. Okay. And here's what he says. He says, the true test of love is when the beloved person stumbles, when his or her weaknesses or even sins come out into the open. The one who truly loves does not withdraw his love, but loves all the more, loves in full consciousness of the other's shortcomings and faults, and without in the least approving of them. Now, this is fascinating because what he's saying is the more that these two people who love each other get closer to each other, the more they're vulnerable with each other, the more that can also become scary, right? Because it feels like, oh no, I see that he or she has this weakness, this problem, this shortcoming, this fault, this opposite side of their temperament. I love this part of it, but not so much that part of it. And but he's saying that what often happens is when that happens, when you see this moment, you get scared, right? And so because of the fear that happens in your own heart, you want to try to correct the other person and help them to fix this thing because you feel like I'm tied to it now, right? This affects me, this affects my relationship, this affects my kids, this affects all these things, right? But notice that what he's saying is the one who truly loves, they're not going to change their fundamental disposition toward you, that I married this good person, right? I married a good wife, I married a good husband. But what happens is when we see those shortcomings and weaknesses, and all of us have them, right? We get scared. And that actually changes how we speak, how we show up, how we act, and what fundamentally we believe about the other person, right? And when our belief about the other person changes, oh, I married the wrong person. Oh, I see this now, and I go, why didn't I see this before? Then everything that we do and feel changes. And those are the things that begin to cause the breakdown of the relationship. So I read this and I was like, oh my gosh, this is so wise. Like I didn't even see this in myself until I saw him say that. And then I kind of woke up to that a little bit more. The idea that we need to also take responsibility for ourselves. Like, in other words, things break down also when we feel like the fault is always the other person. Like, here's the reason why I'm right. Everybody, if I were to explain this objectively, they would say I'm right, But we never did that in the beginning of the relationship. We never became the lawyer to prove why the other person is bad, right? We were doing something completely different, and that's why love would thrive, right? We saw them in their goodness, and we saw that goodness was the godliness in them, and we touched it and we felt it, and it was so real and beautiful, and we wanted more of that. And I think the reality is you can have that. You can have that even though you see those flaws and you don't approve them, right? You're not saying go ahead, just be a terrible person, right? But you can still create that. And in fact, it's even deeper because you see those things, right?
I,
And you choose to love anyway.
I think the connection with Matthew 19 and that second part about grace, right? That it's one thing to recognize my own faults, because I'm kind of the master of my own will, and even though I have habits, and by golly, changing habits are hard. But I'm the one who's either stinks at changing habits or I'm like excellent at changing habits. But then when you're bound to somebody else, right, in a marriage, right, in conjoined or conjunct, yoked to someone else, sometimes there's a projection that I can change that other person in the same way that I would change myself, which is hilarious when you yourself stink at changing your habits and you try to do the same thing that you do to yourself to change someone else's habits. It's sort of like, it doesn't work in the first person. Why should it work in the second person?
Right.
And I think that kind of taps into the need for grace, right? The need for kind of the three to get married, right? Understanding that as I turn to God to heal kind of the wounds inside myself, as I work on Jason, right? So too, do I need to bring God into a relationship in marriage, right? That the spouse is a beloved child of God, needs the same kind of healing for the wounds that cause the habits and the hangups and those kinds of things that maybe utterly irritate me, and to kind of see it in a problem solving way, and not something that I need to fix directly, as if they were some sort of instrument of me, right? But kind of to and I think it comes up in a lot of your work, and that is kind of our pivot right now, to kind of I need some sort of coaching, right? Sort of trusted witness, someone to perhaps allow me to see, when I say that out loud, I'm trying to fix a spouse in the same way that I try to horribly, my horrible track record of fixing myself, and I'm trying to do the same thing. It just sounds kind of ridiculous when you say it out loud like that, right? And so I think some of your work with Adored for Life is really up that vein of providing a good mirror and a healthy mirror for that. So again, thank you for your insights on the theology of the body. I want to give you some time to share your work with Adored for Life with our audience, and to let them know how they can follow it.
Yeah, thank you so much for this opportunity. I think if anything you can see from this interview, and I'm so glad to have had the time for this, is that I'm just so passionate about marriage. I believe that when marriage succeeds and thrives, the world succeeds and thrives. I'm thinking of one quote from John Paul who says that civilization passes by way of the family, and but the family stands on the love of man and woman, and that is the glue for the family. And so the work that I do outside of university teaching is I have a coaching program called Adored for Life, because I believe that this is the name to that fundamental ache in every woman's heart: to be pursued, to be adored, to be loved tenderly in her marriage. I learned a lot of insights through reading a lot of things, but the best ones I found were directly from the work of John Paul II. He talks about how women have a much deeper ache for tenderness in marriage, and why that is, and how you can have this. And I put all this together, everything I learned, in a program that I share with others, and you can get coaching on that as well. It's a woman-to-woman program, sharing the secrets of how to create intimacy, right? How to create that in your marriage, especially after you have come to see shortcomings, faults, other things, right? How do you, in spite of all of those things, how do you actually create the very thing that you want? How do you make your man feel loved in the deepest way possible as a man, right? As a way that only a woman can touch his heart. And how do you receive all that love and intimacy that you want and desire in your relationship, even though there's problems, right? Even though nobody's perfect. And the reason I started this as well is because I just saw that the conversation, and I mentioned this earlier, needs to go deeper, right? It can't just be like, okay, well, we tried and now we leave, and the other side, well, it's just this Kantian rigorism. Well, you're not meant to be happy anyway, and that was a problem in your thinking to begin with. I say that is not how the Creator created them, right? I'm not the only one saying it. I'm citing scripture and others. And so, so I developed this program. It's been very, very successful. It's a wild ride into really going really, really deep in the details of how do you eliminate the drama and problems that you see in your relationship. That's part one. Second part, how does your man feel loved in the way that only his woman can love him? Part three is how to increase tenderness and emotional intimacy in the relationship. I believe that it's possible. I've seen it myself. One of the things that's just sharing something that bugs me is when I hear people say, oh, love is not a feeling. And I get what they mean by that. They're not just saying if something doesn't feel good, just abandon everything, right? I get that. But it's so wrong when it comes to actually cultivating loving feelings toward each other. And I just see that, especially in the Catholic world, we haven't gone deep enough with this. We haven't, to say what you're doing, look at the treasures of our tradition and bring forth the wisdom that's actually really there in a way that can serve us at a practical level. So if you're interested in anything I have to say, my work is at adoredforlife.com. It's ADOREDFORLIFE.com. And it's there where I help women be pursued and adored and loved tenderly in their marriages.
And on that note, because it is one-on-one coaching, woman to woman, me not being a woman, yet I know, right, that perhaps in sort of like improving your life and in sort of the sacramental sphere, the hardest part about going to confession is getting in the confessional line, right? Like I always feel that once I get into that line, like hardest part is over, right? That like, okay. And then like, here's this, everything kind of follows suit. There's a card usually you can read, your act of contrition and those kinds of things. But if you go to adoredforlife.com, and we got the link in the description for you folks, it kind of leads you towards, right, kind of filling out your information, and you hit send. So like what happens after that, in the sense of maybe a woman knows there's something off in her marriage, but isn't like in a crisis mode yet. So is this only for kind of women in kind of marriage crisis mode, kind of like fried green tomato style or something? I don't know.
Right.
Or is it for those who simply realize something's missing, right? That she or he has lost that loving feeling. It's not all about feelings, but as embodied human beings, right, our emotions are important, and that connection, that emotional connection, and opposed to the intellectual connection, opposed to like the moral, right? Are you fulfilling your obligations of marriage in terms of your actions, right? The whole of us is kind of drawn into marriage. So what would you say to the woman who is kind of on the fence about reaching out to you, to the other people you have working with you, in terms of seeking help through Adored for Life?
Yeah, I would say it's not only in a crisis situation. It's better if you don't get to that point to begin with. It's great. I would say if you're early on in your marriage, if you want more in your marriage, I mean, the great thing about coaching is challenging you to do the things and holding you accountable, so that you receive the deeper desire that you want. So it's for those who maybe feel like something is a little bit off or missing, or you start to see, your relationship go down a little bit. You're having arguing or fighting. If you're already separated, this is also for you. There's a part in, I think it's Familiaris Consortio, where John Paul says he's begging for somebody to step up and help separated couples reunite in their marriage, right? And he says this is what needs to happen. But quite frankly, and one of the reasons I started this is I almost never see support for that. I almost never see friends rally, because you want to be with the person and show empathy when someone's hurting, but sometimes rally around and just confirm you in not getting what you want. And the craziest thing is, the more you focus on not getting what you want, the more you're not going to get it, right? You have to take a step in a different direction. And so I created this, part of is a response to what John Paul actually called for. And so, yeah, I would say it's for anyone who you want more, you want to understand the principles of complementarity, you want to have a great marriage even before things start to get a little bit frustrating. If they are frustrating, it's for you. If you're kind of already at a deeper crisis point, this is also for you, because why? It's going to show you how to stop, how basically like the problems that you think are the problems, they can be resolved in a different way. Once you understand the principles of intimacy that are actually founded in the genuine sexual complementarity between a man and a woman. And it's amazing, right? And it's amazing when you can understand in a deep way, emotionally, how to connect with your beloved. And I know that was something we've been saying all this last hour, is that there's a deep ache in the human heart for that. It's not wrong to long for it, and it's possible.
Wonderful, wonderful. And I think as we're into kind of wedding season, right? If you have a relative getting married, anytime soon, or a young woman or whatever, and you don't like whatever's on the wedding registry, you don't want to be the relative that buys towels or linens or china or whatever. This might be a great opportunity. Hey, we've got this coaching. Would you like to do this before the marriage, right? As a newlywed and that kind of thing, to really kind of get that marriage off on the right foot. Kind of understanding what our desires are in the beginning, what God's plan for marriage is, more than just simply the required pre-marriage sort of training as a couple, but to actually have a coach to walk you through the first months, the first year of marriage. Adored for Life, I think, is a great opportunity for family, right? The friends to help a newly married woman kind of grow in that vocation. So again, thank you for your being our guest today, Irene, and for all the work you're doing with Adored for Life, and for the teaching and the research on sexual complementarity and the wisdom of John Paul II. From all of us here at the Confederal Reserve and the BetterPears Cultural Empire, thank you, the audience, for watching. We'll see you next time on the Confederal Reserve. Bye now. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. You can click here to watch a recent interview of the Confederal Reserve, or over here to view the playlist of the BetterPears podcast.